So I will kick us off. Welcome, everyone. Just a brief intro about famtech.org. For those who may be joining, might be your first interaction with us, but we are a group of about 175 innovators, partners, investors across the care economy. We're really focused on uniting the innovation ecosystems of femtech, parent tech, kid-tech, and age tech. So first breath, the last breath, and everything in between. I'm in New York today. We do virtual and in-person events. So right after this will be our New York event, talking about the importance of first generational and immigrant founders along the care continuum and what that journey looks like. So thrilled to be hosting that and extra excited about today's event. I was not going to give up on this one. We weren't going to cancel and reschedule because this is one of the hardest nuts to crack when you go to market. So while I hand it over to Lauren, I'd like to invite everybody who's on the call to put their name, their company, and location in the chat. We'll see how this works in the Google environment. But really thrilled to have everyone here today. I'll hand it over to you, Lauren.
Amazing. Thank you, Anna. I'm so glad to see that many of our community were still able to join despite the Zoom outage. Thank you, everyone, for bearing with and being flexible, coming over the Google Meets. So just to orient folks, we are in week 5 of our HR We There Yet series. And as a quick reminder, I am our entrepreneur in residence at FamTech, co-founder of Cocoon. And really, my goal is to give back to this community and help us demystify some of these really, really challenging parts of starting a company and going into market, selling into HR, of which we have 2 really awesome experts with us today, Patrick and Kalina. And I'm going to just give a really quick intro on both of them. So Kalina, if you don't mind waving real quick to say hi to everyone. I'm not sure we have, Zoom has that like pin functionality, but I don't know if Google Meets probably doesn't have that functionality.
Yeah, so, you can pin here. I'll try to.
Oh, you can. Amazing. Okay, perfect. So Kalina is our former VP of Wellbeing at Sequoia, which is a very, very tech-forward brokerage, has incredible clients, largely high-growth tech companies. And Kalina is an absolute expert in bringing in innovative solutions because as part of leading the well-being group within Sequoia, she brought in solutions like carrot fertility and so forth. And was also very instrumental in helping me as part of Cocoon break into the broker world, giving us all the ropes in our first intros there. So super excited to have her here with us. She's also the founder of Both And, which is, Kalina, you can share more about it, but an incredible community of folks who are doing both parenting and also figuring out their careers. And I would say for me personally, that resonates so much. I know Patrick and I also chatted about that too. Many of us are navigating that experience as we speak. So glad to have Kalina on the line.
Thank you for the intro.
And we also have Patrick Parsons. Patrick, if you can give everyone a quick wave. Amazing. So Patrick is coming to us from Seattle area. And Patrick is really kind of our expert who is empathetic, understands what it's like to be on the outside as a founder, as a salesperson, selling into working with brokers, figuring out how to work with them, because he did that for many, many years at the likes of care.com, Level, and so on. And so really excited to have the viewpoint of Kalina from the inside as far as, okay, having sat in the shoes of a really well-known brokerage who is adopting innovative solutions, and Patrick having sold into that aspect, being able to really bring those insights to this community. So thank you both for being with us. And I won't kind of belabor the agenda too much because I know we're already running a few minutes late due to the outage, but I really want to start with just the 101 on working with brokers, because it truly is, in a lot of ways, a black box. I didn't know when starting Cocoon even what a broker was, to be honest, or how like really, really basic things like who pays brokers? How are they incentivized? And so what we heard from all of you is that we really want to start with a broker 101, just lay of the land. Okay, like let's get to the basics first. And from there, we're to transition into a quick breakout before doing a more fireside chat style conversation with Kalina and Patrick on how strategically do you really kind of get into selling and working with brokers when you have a new solution. All right. So with that, Kalina and Patrick, I want to just start with this 101 lay of the land. And Kalina, since you were in the shoes of a brokerage firm, can you just kind of give us an overview of, first of all, what even is a broker? How do they make money? Like, how are they incentivized?
Yes. So I will not bore you. I could get into this for a really long time, but the essential is brokers act as the intermediaries between employers and the benefit carriers. So if you are a company that's growing and you get to the size that you need to provide your own employees with benefits, you oftentimes first go to like a PEO or something that you outsource all of it. But at the time you hire someone who does HR and benefits, you usually partner then with a broker. And the broker's job is to help when it comes to negotiating rates with the carriers, helping to identify other vendors. Like that's your go-to person in company. So when I was at Sequoia, for example, that was what we did, right? So our job was to recommend benefit strategies. So not just like you should work with Cigna or Anthem, but here's how you should shape your deductibles. And this is the copays that are competitive and so on. We also recommended, of course, point solutions. That was what my company did. So to Lauren's point, if you want to roll out a fertility vendor, who are the vendors that do that? Who should you go with? That's what we did. And then, of course, support like the year-round employee experience when it comes to benefits and how they do it. How they make their money. So this depends on the size of the broker, size of the clients, a few incentives, but to break it into like three main categories, they either one, make commissions from insurance carriers. That's determined by like the board of insurance. So like 2%, 8% of premiums. They can override or bonus incentives from vendors for volume, or they do like flat consulting or admin fees. So you might find like sometimes smaller clients, they're just doing a commission model. And then when people get really big, self-insured, so on, they go to like sort of more flat fees. There's also some new disclosure rules, which you guys can get really nerdy if you want to dig into these, but brokers do have to reveal their commissions. This is kind of across the board with like real estate, things like that too, and vendor compensation. So nowadays, brokers have to be really thoughtful because they used to sometimes get away with charging really crazy amounts to clients. And now they have to disclose that. So oftentimes that's when a client might go from doing the commissions model to negotiating a flat fee that makes more sense for them.
Yeah, one thing that I didn't know when first working with the broker community was that brokers are not paid by the employer usually, although in some cases there's a consulting model, to your point, Kalina, because actually they're paid by the so to speak vendors or solution, the folks who are have solutions that they want to distribute to the employer, whether it's health insurance, whether it's a point solution like a fertility solution or a leave management solution.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why a lot of times, people are choosing their brokers off who does the best service when they're at a certain size, because the brokers actually like don't have a ton of range of costs when it comes to the like actual charge that you get from insurance carriers. It's more about like the additional services they provide, like a mobile app or embedded vendors, to your point, or things like that. So
yeah. So maybe a quick follow-up question on this, and Patrick would love for you to chime in with your thoughts too, is why then, if they're not being employed exactly, meaning being paid by the employer, like let's say an employer like Benchling, right? We just had Vivek on last time around. Then do they have so much influence over the HR leaders' decision making, whether it's bringing in the right health insurance and or point solutions?
Yeah, I think the role of the broker has evolved quite a bit over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And I mean, even to that point, when I started at ADP 15 years ago, they weren't even working with brokers. And now they have an entire segment that's a channel partner that they have salespeople that work specifically through the broker channel. So I would say as the role of the broker evolved, they have become that trusted confidant. And a lot of times, I guess the non-political answer is if you're in HR, sometimes you use a consultant or a broker to help you make a decision as a little bit of a risk protection yourself as you're making those decisions. If it sometimes backfires on you internally, you might pass some of that over to the consultant or broker as helping them make the decision. But also, a lot of times it's a very trusted and long-term relationship between the broker and the employer. So they do trust that the broker's going out and looking for the innovative solutions, the new things in the market, and helping support their overall strategy.
That makes a ton of sense, Patrick. So just kind of like play that back. Essentially, because these topics like figuring out health insurance are so complex, there's a lot of reliance on the trusted advisor who is the broker to help an employer and HR leader navigate that and make the right decisions, sometimes a little CYA, as you mentioned. But as a result, as they're thinking about other parts of the decision-making process, such as solutions like, hey, what do I want to do for fertility? Or how do I think about leave management? Or how do I think about well-being, for example, they're often also going to that same advisor. Is that a good way to frame it?
Yeah, and I think the last piece of that is the broker or the consultant really is meant to be there and support with compliance as well. And as the compliance landscape has changed immensely over the last 10, 15 years, brokers have helped navigate that compliance piece and how all of these benefits and solutions combine into one, and making sure that employers not only compliant, but meeting their strategy to offer the best benefits.
For sure. Especially as folks have gone more and more distributed too, as employers have had employees across many different states versus just a few states kind of following COVID, that became an even bigger factor, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
We certainly saw that with Cocoon when it comes to just even leave laws, for instance.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Since every state has their own.
Yes. So I think that brings me to my second kind of 101 question for you, Patrick, which is why brokers matter. As in, I just want to preface this by saying I found brokers to be incredibly critical with Cocoon in terms of, even if I wasn't in the early days, for example, being introduced through a broker, they were often going to be part of the decision-making process, for example, down the road. But I've met several founders who have told me things like, hey, I actually just stopped working with brokers because I have found it's a waste of time. And I've just been banging my head against the wall with brokers and getting no traction. So I just haven't really been going down that route. And personally, I think it's a huge missed opportunity, but I want folks to hear kind of from folks like you, Patrick, who've done the process before. Why does it matter for a startup who's kind of growing and scaling their revenue?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Funny story. One of the first large at care.com, when I first joined my first week on the job, there was a decree that we were no longer working with brokers because they kept ruining our deals and they kept killing our deals. So that obviously we didn't go that path, but it was interesting to see someone who didn't work with the broker and consultant community in the past. I can see how people would just shy away from that channel strategy and feel like going directly to the employer is key. So as the number of solutions have increased in the market right now, the number of outreaches to the employers directly has also increased. So on average, some of my friends that are on the employer side receive somewhere upwards of 15 to 20 outreaches a day from different solution providers. A lot of them in there, and I also want to preface, I have worked mostly in the enterprise jumbo employer space. So 10,000 life companies and greater that usually go with one of the big three consulting firms, your Aon, Mercer, WTW, and sprinkle in there's some locked in, and there's always a one-off, and there's relationships with people that have had. I know Sequoia has a large book of national accounts as well. So I will say a lot of those relationships with those larger employers, there's in the consulting agreements that the broker or consultant is in charge of vetting new solutions. So all that employer is going to do is oftentimes forward that email that you send directly to the employer, straight to the consultant. And there's nothing that makes a consultant more frustrated than having to dig through hundreds of emails a day on solutions. And then again, it's a dance of knowing when you're going to get support from the consultant or broker and not. But it is ultimately important to have a strategy in this channel because of the influence that they do have over the buying process. They oftentimes have a catalog of solutions either in your space or innovative solutions that are going to be presented in an annual strategy meeting. And so it's their job to compile everything and then come to the employer and work side by side with them on their long-term roadmap. And a lot of the time on a large employer, that could be 24, 36, even 48-month roadmap on what they're going to do within that benefit solution space.
Yeah, so it sounds like, Patrick, first of all, there's an issue of noise, right? And cutting through the noise where, frankly, I mean, the amount of outbound emails likely that any given employer, well, whether it's an El Meza or a Vivek from our conversation the prior week are getting are dozens and dozens a day, right? And so in a lot of ways, you want to leverage these trusted advisors to cut through the noise and get to ultimately the end customer.
Correct.
That's a key piece.
Yeah.
Kalina, anything you would add from your perspective, especially given kind of how you thought about it from Sequoia?
Yeah, I mean, I'll get into this a little bit, but we had likewise so many vendors that would reach out, and it was really a lot to sift through. And then even the ones we looked up, our clients were passing us ones, right? Because they were getting hit up by all these vendors. So it is a lot, and every vendor has a different system and way of organizing this. And then even at the individual level, brokers have their own persona that they want to either just do it by the book of their brokerage, or they want to be the innovative one within their own company. So I think a lot of it was just trying to, see vendors that were standing out and being unique, giving us really good data, showing how they were different, just making it easy to see their solution. Like, I know we'll get into this meat in the session, but yeah, it's really learning about how to get into both like the brokerage firms in itself, but also those individuals who on LinkedIn are outwardly talking about innovation, or, a little bit more open to hearing those conversations, which I think more and more people are starting to do, which is helpful as vendors, as you see those people who might be outwardly, interested in advising in innovation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. 'Cause, for the broker's perspective, they're also competing in a lot of ways for the employer's attention, where folks don't realize, this is something that I learned, that brokers themselves have either an opportunity to renew the business or get fired, so to speak, every year as well. And so they are also incentivized to be thoughtful and bring innovative solutions, kind of to your point, Kalina.
Totally. Yeah. Our job is to do what the client wants. So whatever that is, there's the by the book scope of service, and then there's what you do not to lose clients. So
yes, totally. Okay. So real quick, Patrick, you had briefly mentioned the big three. I always hear these terms around brokers, and it's so confusing when you don't know the landscape in terms of what the different brokerage firms are, how are they structured, all these different titles. It's like navigating HR, where people, our community tells us all the time, like, what's total rewards versus benefits versus learning and development? And in brokerage firms, you have all these different names out there, like Willis Towers Watson, Sequoia, Aon, Marsh McLennan, et cetera, et cetera. And then there's all these titles like producers and client success managers, and who do you even go to? So, Kalina, can you help us just kind of break down this lay of the land first in terms of, for our founders, for instance, who are selling into SMB versus mid-market versus enterprise, even the brokerage firms they go to, for example, just to start, are going to be different, right? So can you help us just get a lay of the land there?
Totally. So as I was kind of prepping for this session, I tried to write this out. So, and you guys can always message me at any time and ask for follow-ups on this. But basically, when you think about how brokers are structured, think of it in three segments. So 1, there's the local regional brokers. 2, there's national brokers. And 3, there's large-scale consulting houses. So regional brokers are going to be really small, almost like mom and pop shops. Sometimes they're even individual consultants that just like have an office. Like they usually deal with small businesses like 0 to 250 employees. So they might just do business like within that town or within that city, but they're usually very specific. And then there's the national brokerages. So that's like where I'd say Sequoia sat in. This is what's considered mid-market. So mid-market, when you think of the broker land, is usually like 250 to 3,000 employees. And so, that broker might say they deal with large employers and they might define size differently. But when we think about it from like the broader picture, that's the mid-market. So that's like, Sequoias and Navas and like all of those of the world. A lot of the ones that you might see that are a little bit more like techie, or some of them are even VC backed themselves, like that's that. And then the large consulting houses are what we talk about the top 3 bigger ones. That's Aon, Mercer, Willis Towers Watson, and those are jumbo clients. So that's like 3,000 to 10,000 and above, like usually self-insured clients. And if anyone wants offline to break down like difference between fully insured and self-insured, like I'm not going to get a ton into that, but the short answer for that is like a fully insured company is where the rates are set with the insurance carrier. So Cigna says, we think you're going to spend $1 million a year, client, and they commit to that, and they charge them as if they're going to be $1 million a year. And if they spend above that, they still pay $1 million. If they spend below that, unfortunately, they still pay $1 million. When companies get really, really big, they rely on like an Aon or a Mercer to handle their claims and population a little bit better, because they don't want to be leaving money on the table. They don't want to have $1 million in claims, but Cigna charges them for $2 million. They just want to pay exactly what the claims are. So I say that in the context of when you're thinking of who you're targeting or working with, just remember that like the smaller the broker, those local, sometimes national, their book of business typically has a mix of the fully insured and self-insured, with the fully insured being the ones who don't see as much of their claims data. Like the "we're going to save you money on claims" pitch isn't necessarily as relevant, versus the self-insured clients definitely care more about that because they're paying out all the claims. So that's kind of like the segments. And then you have the book of business. So like a broker's book of business is their employer portfolio. So it depends on size, industry, funding type, geography, all of it. So when you're talking to a broker, it can be helpful to be like, what's the average size of your client? And do you mostly work with self-funded employers? So thinking about, as you go to that employer market, like who it makes the most sense for you to work with. If you're dealing in like the medical space and you are someone who's saying we're going to reduce your claims, you're probably better off going after self-insured companies in the long run, not necessarily right away, but that's who it usually is the good selling point. But if you're like a caregiving company or something that you can obviously make an argument for data, but maybe it's not as obvious how it ties into healthcare. That is more about like the return on investment, employee happiness, like that can be anyone. And then so getting into like who you work with, this is the most confusing thing. And like I should probably make a map at some point, but even at Sequoia, our titles were always changing. But everyone for the most part usually has someone who at the top is like the producer, the consultant, the principal, the salesperson. They bring in new business, right? So they're the ones going after the clients, bringing them in. And then you have the account manager and the client service consultant. That's day to day. So Sequoia called that exactly that: client service consultant, client service manager. That was the one who was usually the person the client emailed first if they had a question about vendors. And then if it was something urgent or they wanted more involvement, they bump it up to that producer, consultant, principal. And then you had other people in the practice that kind of referred to as practice leaders, innovation leads. So within Sequoia, that was a compliance person, someone who specialized in leave, DEI, wellness, all different things like that. And then on the partnership side, there's also a lot of times outward partners, which we can get into later, but like within the company, there's usually divisions for like leave and disability, well-being, risk management, total rewards, 401k, compliance. Like a lot of times they handle all of that, especially if they're a global company. That's like a big piece of it too. So yeah, it's a complex system for sure, but I think the sum of it is just being like, if there's anything you can take away from understanding how these markets are segmented, it's just trying to understand the fully insured versus self-insured side of it, and then who at the company is usually the day-to-day person for the client, because that's usually who they'll be looping in if you reach out.
The theme I'm really getting, Kalina, is that it's really easy to bark up the wrong tree if you don't know the landscape very well. And I will say I definitely did that in the early days of figuring out navigating brokers because, first of all, just like how you might think about early adopter employers, right? If you're trying to if you're trying to get the likes of, let's say, a high growth tech company like Benchling, who is a few hundred people in the mid market, going to, let's say, Aon is not going to be like the right brokerage firm, for example, right? So figuring out, okay, first of all, which brokerage firms even serve the segment that I'm going after as my early adopter is kind of step one. And then to your point about titles, it's about, okay, who at that brokerage firm do I even reach out to? And it sounds like from your recommendation, Kalina, that the client service side of the house, in terms of the folks who are really the day-to-day managing the relationship, can often be a good starting point.
Yeah, and my I know we're recording, but off the record response of it too is like people always ask, do I go client first or the broker? And I always kind of say both at the same time. Like neither, like the broker wants you to go to them first, not the client. The client wants you to go to them first, not the broker, so they can discover it. And so I always kind of with vendors, I'd be like, if you really have a good network connection at a client, reach out to them at the same time, reach out to the broker because they both kind of hedge each other. Like if you are a broker, you might see a vendor come in and ignore them. But if the client brings them up, you have to pay attention. And likewise on the client side, you might ignore a vendor, but if your broker brings it up, you might really trust their judgment. So it's kind of like going both ways. And so a lot of times when I'm consulting on clients, I talk about that, right? Like you kind of have to work both systems and work with each other on it. But it's not really like chicken or the egg. It's kind of just like both at the same time to be most
multi-threading, so to speak, in sales lingo,
exactly.
right? Yeah. Patrick, anything you'd add from your perspective, having kind of navigated this web?
Yeah, I say when you get in the larger consulting houses, you have someone that is usually a relationship. They own they're the consultant of record. So they're the ones that are actually doing the day-to-day work on full strategy. And those are a lot of the time your principal consultant. So they're going to have the key relationships with, say, a Microsoft, an Amazon, a Starbucks. They're going to, or Nike, or they're going to be the lead. They're going to bring in the teams that they have working with them. And there, unfortunately, is no right way to, every single client is different and every single broker has a team that they operate differently with. So, I mean, as an example, when I started working with and pursuing Starbucks, when I was at care.com, I did some relationship mapping and found that their consultant at Aon was really good friends with them from when the head of Total Rewards, the SVP of benefits and Total Reward at Starbucks, was working at Aon Hewitt with one of the lead principal consultant. So at that point, I just pursued a single individual because I knew that they were really close. They and had been told that from other people. Now there's other shops and other principal consultants that may have acquired a client and they're less hands-on. It's less relationship. It's more strategy. And you just kind of have to understand when you're calling those people, what is it that makes them tick? What does the relationship look like between them and the employer? But I would stay away from a producing consultant. A lot of the times they're going to get new business. And a lot of the time they're trying to get a consultant of record document signed, or a broker, a BOR, or a COR. And those, a lot of the time they're going to talk about the innovativeness of their firm, less down to the level of a single solution. So a producing consultant, often, if they are asked by an employer, they'll go do some work, or they'll call, like in Mercer, they've got a healthcare innovations team, and they'll call that team, or they'll pull up their Bible of vendors and get the information from there. They are not going to be the ones that are taking your solution to the employer on your behalf. So that's going to be more of the principal consultant. And then also your client management teams. And then also there's, layers in there that now are focused on more even specific lines around wellness, that their entire job is to put together in that strategy session meeting early in the year what is important and what kind of goals the employer is trying to meet. And so they pull all that together.
Yeah, so really knowing the persona at the other end is super key, it sounds like. And then I think something interesting that you mentioned, Patrick, was if let's say you have almost like a short list, or what's often called a named account list in sales lingo, of employers that you're targeting to be customers or clients of your solution, then in a lot of ways, kind of like the way to figure out how to get into them is actually this consultant of record, broker of record information that you're referring to.
Correct. Yep. And a lot of people, you can get keys to that through, there's public documents, a form 5500, which is a publicly accessible document that oftentimes will give you a good starting point to understand who, at least the name of the firm. So you're not having to, you might not know who at the firm owns the relationship, but at least it points you, it narrows it down a bit.
Yes, totally. Okay. And by the way, as we're having this conversation, folks, I usually preface the conversation with please feel free to ask questions throughout, whether that's raising your Google hand or dropping a question in the chat. We also will have dedicated Q&A time with Kalina and Patrick towards later in this session, but just wanted to give that quick plug since I know folks probably are thinking a lot about some of these topics as we're chatting about them. Okay, so related to figuring out who to go to is when. And this I had no idea of whatsoever when I first started navigating, kind of working with brokers with Cocoon. But actually, just like how there's a sales cycle when it comes, like often there's a good time to reach out to the employer, the client, for instance, when you're introducing yourself or trying to, like get, let's say, your solution into an employer for the first time. The same thing really applies to brokers. And so, Patrick, would love your perspective in terms of what I'm calling kind of like the broker cycle. So brokers have to go through this cycle, and there are certain times when they're going to be super heads down and not really, conducive to or super open to introducing new solutions, but others when they're really interested in learning. And would love to hear your experience with that.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So back to the roadmap, a lot of large employers, I say anytime that you get over 5,000 employees, they have a dedicated benefits roadmap that is set, that is gone through a budgetary review and an evaluation, a strategic evaluation with key stakeholders within the organization and external, including their consultant. So that, and that's usually between a 3 and 5 year roadmap. So you always are trying to get on the roadmap. I was just working with a solution for Microsoft. They spent 18 months evaluating and getting the solution on the roadmap. They went through 18 months of vetting and evaluation. And then at the last meeting, it was removed from the 1/1/25 roadmap. So a lot of these can be heartbreaking because you do spend so much time getting in that roadmap, working through the strategy, and then a lot of the time that can be cut at the last minute. But I would say if you're looking at a more generalistic view from a 5,000 plus size employer that's working with one of the big 3 consulting firms, Q1 is going to be your strategy sessions. They are meeting with the employer. They called it. We have a quarterly or a annual strategy meeting, and they always happen Q1. Q1 is when they look at what's on the roadmap. They look at their budget for next year, and then they start looking at what they're going to implement for the 1/1 of the following year. So you have to be out in front of something by about 10 to 11 months before you can get that, even thinking about getting that implemented at an employer. The Q2 is when they go through more of the vetting. So if they say, hey, we're Q1, we know that we need a fertility benefit for this year, or we need to increase our fertility benefit. It's on the roadmap. It's on the strategy for this year. Then Q2 is the evaluation phase. They will bring in the consultant will work with different vendors. They'll go through the evaluation. A lot of the time that'll be the pricing pitch, strategy there that you'll work with the consultant. Sometimes you'll work with the employer. And then end of Q2, early Q3, employer will present those solutions and their recommendation. And then early to mid Q3, you start, you look at contracting. A lot of the times I've had some of them even start looking at contracting at late Q2 because a lot of those do take an extended period of time within a large employer to get contracted. And then, Q3, end of Q3, early Q4 is implementation.
Yeah, so timing it is super important. Of course, there's the influence part. How do you even get onto the roadmap in the first place with these enterprise, right? And we talked about that with Elle last time around too. But then timing it, you have to make sure that you're getting in pretty early in some of these strategy conversations, to your point, Patrick. Yeah. And Kalina, is this similar in the mid-market? Can you kind of like help us think, like being in the shoes of, let's say, like a broker at Sequoia, right? Like, when is a good time to be engaging?
I mean, always. Like so I say that just because every department's a little different. I think generally fall to winter, anytime between September and end of the year is a bad time. Like apart from that, I think it's all free game. September is just like middle of OE. They're rolling out the benefits. They're checking the benefits. People are on vacation for holidays. Like it's kind of a black hole that time of year. But I think anywhere between January and August is like, you can always usually not get the attention of someone, but it's a good time to reach out. The earlier, the better. I think the sweetest spot where people are like finishing up OE and looking is more like spring, summer. And so I think that's like when in Sequoia world, we were looking at a lot of like innovative things early on in the year leading into the summer. And then employers were starting to make their decisions for mid-market more in like the June, July timeframe, with a lot of things wrapping up by August. The bigger the employer, the earlier they started that. Some people, it was like they finished OE in January, a meeting was on their calendar to talk about 2026, right? So it just depends, but for the most part, people are doing it like mid-year. I just think in general, like making sure that you're keeping brokers up to date on anything you're doing and then just being tasteful about it, right? So like not necessarily a greatest time to do a product release in November, but if you do something, it's timely, there's a PR thing, it's an awareness day related to what you do, like it's still relevant to reach out. So a little bit of like a different thought on that. And that like, I definitely think like exactly what Patrick said, there's like a good selling cycle and where exactly you want to fit in. But I think if you have something that feels timely or it's like a big PR, social, news heavy related thing, like you can always just ping the broker because that stuff's really relevant too.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful in terms of thinking about the mid-market, where in the enterprise, there's a lot less, where Patrick has a lot of experience selling in, for example, there's a lot less flexibility, but in mid-market, there's more flexibility in terms of buying in different times of year. But the key is don't be trying to reach out to a broker to present your solution during OE, or as Anna defined in the chat, open enrollment period, when folks are about to go live with their benefits on January 1st, because people are really heads down there, both the brokers and the employers themselves.
Yeah. And I would say also reach out to, like, once it passes, I don't know, let's call it June, try to reach out to the broker more than the employer, because nothing drives an employer also more crazy than like an employer hearing about something in July when we've already finalized their benefits, and then they want to evaluate it, and all of a sudden like everything's thrown in the mix. So if you want to make brokers your friends, also maybe just tap them and they can be like, hey, let's revisit next year, or like, hey, we just did this. And likewise, it makes the broker look bad sometimes because they're like, why didn't you tell us about this earlier? So just try to do it earlier if you can, if it's a newer thing. Otherwise, if you're already friendly with the broker, you can kind of, make sure to touch base on all times.
Calling
yeah,
in is a good way to get a deal killed.
Yeah, exactly.
Super, super helpful. And I know, thank you, Patrick, for answering some of the questions in the chat on Form 5500. Also a question on conferences as well. The one thing I will say on things like conferences is, just like you find different employers use different brokerage firms, like some, for example, if you're selling into mid-market employers, you may be going to a Sequoia, but if you're selling into enterprise, you may be going to a Mercer or Willis Towers Watson, for example. Conferences are very similar. So the one thing I would just flag for folks on the line is you really want to be targeted about your conferences as well. And we can always kind of offline talk about like what some of the key conferences are, depending on who, from an employer perspective, your target audience is. Anything you'd add to that, Patrick, since I know you were kind of mentioning about conferences?
No, it is a tricky thing, and understanding who is attending conferences every year changes, and that's a whole song and dance as well. So you could set up an entire another call on which conferences to go to and which ones to not go to.
Yeah. All right. So I know we have just a short time today, so I'm not going to go into our breakout room, but I do want to kind of transition to some of these like meatier, less 101 questions now that we've got a bit of a lay of the land. And I want to just start with actually, what do brokers really care about when looking at new solutions? Because at the end of the day, it's like, as you were saying, Patrick and Kalina as well, there's just so much noise out there, right? And so what do they really care about? Is it like how you service their clients? Is it your responsiveness? Like, how do you get in, frankly? What's the strategy? Patrick, can you kind of like give us your thoughts, and then we'd love to kind of go to Kalina from there?
Oh, sorry. One more. I was responding. My fault. What was the question?
Yes. So what do brokers really care about when it comes to new solutions, right? Like, there's so much noise. How do you actually get in? And what are the things that founders could make mistakes on, in terms of maybe you weren't as focused on this aspect, but brokers really care about that?
Yeah, it is. I spent a lot of the time really, and you hit on this earlier, creating a named account list and finding employers that are focused on the type of thing that you're selling. So if you are selling a fertility benefit, for example, you're going to want to look at an employer that prides themselves. They've either made top working lists for women in the workforce. They already have a benefit in that space, and you want to expand on it. I would look at that where you're trying to fit into their ecosystem already, and I think that's the biggest piece, is understanding their strategy. And a lot of the time you can put that together by the way that they outwardly project their benefit offering. So if you go on an employer's website and we have medical, dental, vision, and then that's all they say about their benefits, they're probably not looking for they're not going to be the early adopters. They're not going to be the innovative solution provider. So that's going to be a different way of looking at it. And so you kind of really have to fit in. You got to figure out where you fit into the market, and then be able to identify those named clients that fit your solution as part of their strategy.
Yeah. So it's almost like, one, figuring out the employer strategy, right, before navigating through the broker, because ultimately the broker's not going to present anything that isn't a fit for the employer strategy.
Correct. And then
I think, Go ahead, Patrick.
You can really help the broker look good. Your job, if you can look at your relationships and conversations through a broker as you're trying to help them look good to their employer, they have so many things coming at them left and right: compliance, rate increases, medical, pharmacy. They've got stuff coming everywhere. If you can give them succinct sound bites that they can look really intelligent to their employer, and based on a solution that they know they need. I'll give an example. With Starbucks, I did this. I knew that they were really paternalistic. Like they show it everywhere. They talk about that we support working parents. They support that through part-time. They offer medical benefits to part-time staff. I sat down with their consultant and I said, this fits within their offering, and this is why. If you're able to connect those dots for the consultant or the broker, they can very easily give that story through to that employer for you instead of making it this abstract thing.
The piece around making the broker look smart in front of their client, I think, is really, really key, because ultimately they're also incentivized by retaining their client, right? Kalina, what have you seen work for founders trying to kind of break in with brokers? And then I'm curious if you can give us sort of like your hot take on a common mistake that founders make.
Sure. Yeah, so I think in general, like a lot of it is just, first I say with vendors, recognizing that like you can't pretend you don't have competitors. I think a lot of vendors come in and I'm doing something so innovative and new and no one's done this before. No one's doing what we're doing. And I always like try to very kindly let founders down saying, well, have you heard of this? Or have you heard of this? And so these vendors here, a lot of vendors, and even if you don't view someone to be your competitor, there are competitors out there. And then I'd also just give the advice of, even if something doesn't feel apples to apples with what you're doing, if you're in the same category, they're your competitor. So I would hear all the time, right? Like, let's give it the example of a fertility vendor would say like, oh, you know, that childcare vendor is obviously not a competitor. It's two different things. Well, like at the end of the day, I know it sounds so generic, but like that's the family category. So like if an employer's rolled out a fertility benefit, they're usually not going to roll out a childcare benefit in the same year because they feel like they've checked off a box on it. So it's like, I always say like expand who you think your competitors are, because you're in that same category and you're always going to fight for market space or financial, I guess, space when it comes to it. So that's like, I guess, both the answer your question and the advice in one swoop, is just be really aware of that and often talk about how, you know, understand the benefits that the employer is providing and understand that if they have a childcare benefit and you're a fertility benefit, how are you also talking about how you're a supplementary or, you know, like how you deserve to be in that space and not necessarily just assume that because you don't already have a childcare vendor, that's going to be the replacement. So hopefully that helps. The other thing, I'll put this in the chat, but when you think about what like brokers want to deal with, these were the top, like I was at Sequoia for almost 10 years. And every year it was some variation of those being the top claims, like maternity, MSK, mental health, and then preventative care, lesser claims, but huge claims, obviously cancer, prescriptions, like deviated somewhat, but like usually every year, even like maternity and MSK and mental health were like top three. And I feel like that's pretty nationwide. So if you're thinking about what employers care about, they care a lot about trying to address those things because that's what the employers are seeing glaringly. So there's not always a direct selling case, but if you can connect to those, it's a good in there.
Kalina, you bring up a really
Those are absolute gems.
It's important too, because a lot of the time is what I hear founders go and say, we have a huge ROI.
Yeah.
And you, like in your solution, you might have a good ROI, but that employer might be dealing with huge cancer claims, or their pharmacy costs might have gone up 40% year over year. And those costs are millions of dollars when you're giving a solution that, you know, might not even be a couple $100,000 a year. So while, yes, you might have some ROI on that, in the overall benefit spend, that might be really low. So understanding relativity on your ROI based on what that employer is dealing with is also really key. I've heard that as a pitfall for some founders.
This is so incredibly helpful. Well, I know we're just over time. I wish we had so much more time with both Kalina and Patrick, and bummed that Zoom kind of cut some of our time out this time around. And we usually do some Q&A with the audience as well. But that being said, for FamTech members, please do leverage office hours this week. Happy to answer any follow-up questions there in the Slack channel. And then I know there's lots of questions coming in to Kalina and Patrick. So to Kia, who's our events lead, if you don't mind just posting kind of how to stay in touch with both Kalina and Patrick, that would be super helpful. And thank you, everyone, for your flexibility, figuring out how to navigate Google. And thank you, Kalina and Patrick, for your absolute wisdom, expertise. This is not an easy place to navigate. And I'm sure folks will have lots of follow-up questions after this.
Yeah, happy to connect.
Yeah, I think this kind of is a really great start as far as the lay of the land.
Cool. All right, thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.